All right, fantastic. Looks like we're now live. So welcome everybody to this next installment of our book talk series. We're really excited to be here with Dr. Matthew Butler, who is going to be telling us a little bit about his forthcoming book titled Mexico's Spiritual Reconquest, Indigenous Catholics and Father Perez's Revolutionary Church, to be published with the University of New Mexico Press. We're excited to be here with the Historians of Catholic Mexico Network. I'm going to go ahead and share Dr. Butler's biography now, and he'll begin by sharing some comments with us about his forthcoming work. Dr. Matthew Butler is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of Popular Piety and Political Identity in Mexico's Cristero Rebellion, Michoacán, 1927 to 29. His research interests include the history of modern Mexico, the history of Catholicism in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest, the history of indigenous people, and Mexican agrarian history. At present, he is especially interested in the relationship between Catholicism, modernity, and forms of political liberty in Mexico. In addition to the book we're discussing today, he is currently completing another book titled Liberty in the Church, Catholic Dissent in Modern Mexico, and researching the history of the Mexican bullfight, which I have a lot of questions about, and I'm very excited to hear more about at some point in the future. He is the president of the Texas Catholic Historical Society and director of the Hijuelas Project, a digitization and research project on the history of indigenous communities in 19th century Michoacán, Mexico. Matthew, without further ado, thank you for being here. We'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you to all of those present today, but especially for the chance to come and talk to you about my new book, Mexico's Spiritual Reconquest, Indigenous Catholics and Father Perez's Revolutionary Church. The book is just out, actually. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
So the book is about a very controversial Catholic priest, the revolutionary patriarch Joaquin Perez, and the church he founded, the Iglesia Católica Apostólica Mexicana, or ICAM. The book's also about his political supporters in the Calles regime, and especially his supporters in the Mexican provinces, who are agraristas and indigenous Catholics in the main. So I built the book around Perez's life story because it's a fabulous kind of magical realist kind of tale. But really the book is about three things. It's about indigeneity, it's about Catholicism, and it's about the state and their respective interactions. All this said, I want to give my thanks to my two readers this afternoon, Brian Connaughton, a revered patriarch of Mexican Catholic studies, and Jürgen Buchenau, a veritable jefe maximo of the historiography of the Mexican Revolution. I greatly appreciate your time and your interest in the book, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Once again, thank you to all of those who are here. It was decided to speak in English, but I'm very happy to talk in Spanish in the Q&A at the end. In the next few minutes, I want to do a couple of things, apart from showing you a few images you probably haven't seen before, some of which are too grainy really to go in the book, and so won't be seen there either. First, to explain where the project came from, its origins, why I thought it was worth writing a book about a very discredited figure, a very discredited movement in Mexico, where Perez is still really a hate figure. Revolutionaries hated him because he was a Catholic. Catholics hated him because he was sympathetic to the revolution. He struggled to find the sweet spot between those two contending camps, but I argue that he managed it in the end. I think from this picture you can see that he expected to be rather unpopular. So he was someone who was almost always dismissed as a provocateur, a stooge of the revolution, or just a schismatic, a schismatico. Once upon a time, I had to look that term up myself. It means tear from the Greek, so a rebel Catholic who set himself up against the authority of the Pope and ripped apart Catholic unity under Rome. For reasons that I hope will become clear, I don't use that term in the book, okay, unless it appears in the primary source citations, which it often did. Maybe I should thank Perez for his notoriety and lack of popularity. It made writing the first page of this book very easy, and anyone who sat down to write a page, or page one of a book and stared at a blank screen with a blinking cursor will know what I mean. But for this book, what I had to do was assemble all of the insults that people had thrown at Perez over the years of his involvement in ICAM, and it made for quite a strong gale force kind of introduction to the book. The second thing I want to do today is to set out very briefly the main 5 or 6 claims that the book makes, since I very much doubt that anyone here, bar Brian and Jürgen, and possibly my excellent anonymous reviewers for UNM Press, will have had a chance to read it yet. This is a much more revisionist book than my previous one on the Cristero War. I deliberately set out to reevaluate somebody who had been trashed in historiography, not for its own sake, but because to see what the overall historical picture would look like if we colored in a part of it more convincingly, and that part was obviously Perez's. Having done that, I still would say that Perez's history should make us change a number of our upper range generalizations about Mexican Catholic history, the history of the 1920s, 1930s religious conflict, about secularism, about state formation in revolutionary Mexico, and various other things. I remember a couple of months ago hearing Margaret Chowning talk very wisely about her wonderful book, and saying that often it's the mid-range claims in a book that are the ones that stay the course and do best over time, rather than the more hyperbolic, publisher-friendly copy that we have to write for things. So I'm wondering which of the books here will do best. If I had to guess or pray, I hope it would be the idea that the 1920s religious conflict should be seen essentially as a conflict between different iterations of Catholicism, between different kinds of Catholic culture, one of them more state-affiliated and one of them more heavily Romanized, not just a simple church-state conflict. I would also hope that we can feel in Perez's history some of the importance of indigenous politics and spirituality to this period. We've done an awful lot of cultural history in the last 20 years, but the books that really explore the treasures of indigenous people's spiritual hearts are few and far between. Some of the people who've written them are in this audience, perhaps, but there just aren't that very many of them. So the book came really from a happenstance archival experience in my least favorite archive in Mexico City, the AGN. Years ago, as a postdoc, flicking through the catalog card index of the Dirección General de Gobierno and the Cultos Religiosos series, being very surprised to find one after another for various states, for Mexico, for Veracruz, for Puebla, Oaxaca, Chiapas, a whole series of petitions from usually indigenous municipalities asking for a Mexican priest, for sacerdotes mexicanos. That was really counterintuitive to me and really unexpected, because when we tend to think about Perez, if we think about Perez, the existing historiography really told us 2 things. One was that the ICAM was completely top-down and contrived. Here are the usual suspects: Calles striding through the National Stadium, followed by the Eminos Gris, Luis Morones. So that was one thing. The second thing was that really the significance of this movement was just as a kind of catalyst for the Cristero Rebellion. The incident that everybody knows about is the siege of La Soledad in Mexico City early in 1925. And it's usually seen as a kind of political firefly, a church seizure, a riot, a kind of Keystone Cops tragedy, I think I call it in the book, people running around the streets throwing stones, but of no real significance beyond that. So the effort to create a worker church really fails. So the documents I was finding really contradicted that story and told me that the La Soledad episode was really the tip of the proverbial iceberg. As I say in the introduction to the book, just prologue. I still think La Soledad was important, by the way. It was important as an example of what I call religious cromismo, using kind of Soviet-style antics to take control of Catholic churches, to kind of contrive a worker church out of thin air. But if you read the book, you'll see that the basic conceit of many of the chapters is that La Soledad really creates an unusual political opportunity for Adalberto Tejeda, Calles' interior minister from 1925 to 1928, and our friend Patriarch Perez, Patriarch Perez. So Tejeda, and we see him here on the right, really assumes the official tutelage of Perez from figures like the other person on the left, Ricardo Treviño, a frontline cronista. And Tahir is significant because he really changes the style of Callista religious policy. We get a shift to a much more kind of French-style constitutional religion. Tahir encouraged people to take over the governance of their churches using the powers that were written into Article 130 of the Mexican Constitution, and to completely bypass the Catholic hierarchy while they were doing that. It was a radically invasive kind of religious experiment that he was involved in. It happened in 1926, as we all know, and I think it was a truly important political development because it created, maybe for the first time, the possibility for a popular and indigenous buy-in to the Calles regime's anti-clerical policies and pretensions. This is a map from the book, and I hope you can see the tremendous spread or the take-up of Perez's Mexican church across central, highland, and southern Mexico, all the way from Hidalgo, northern Veracruz, all the way down to Chiapas. There were a few spin-offs actually in the US. They don't make it into the book, but they will appear somewhere else, I hope, at some point. What I found was that literally hundreds of Mexican communities, nearly all of them indigenous, had taken this political opportunity to switch out their Roman Catholic clergy and import people who describe themselves as sacerdotes mexicanos, as Mexican clergy. And when I read through the archival documents that followed this process, especially the church inventories, for example, it was very clear that this was a voluntary process. The church inventories were remarkably complete. Nobody was hiding the Virgin of Guadalupe image. Nobody was burying the church silver. These were complete willing takeovers by one religious group from another. And the people responsible, I guess there were around 200,000 of them, were Nahuas from Mexico and Guerrero, Totonacos from Puebla, Veracruz, Zapotecos from Oaxaca, indigenous groups from Chiapas, and all over the place. And that's really why I decided to call the book Mexico's Spiritual Reconquest, as a nod to Robert Ricard's famous Spiritual Conquest of Mexico book from the 1930s. In actual fact, if you look at that book on the last page, you'll see that Ricard mentions Perez and wonders whether his movement is connected to any of the early religious processes that had happened in Mexico. And the point really is that Perez overran a significant part of the Mexican highlands and the Mexican south in the same way that the Franciscans had, in the same way that the 18th century Bourbon clergy did, in the same way that liberation theologians would do in the 1960s and 1970s, and maybe in the same way that evangelicals have done in more recent times. His movement was part of the long dialectical development of indigenous religiosity in relation to different versions of the state and to different versions of the Catholic Church. Chapter 3 in the book, which I call Mexico's Other Cristiada, is really a radiography of this process. That, I follow these small communities. Again, these are pictures that won't appear in the book, in Veracruz, in Chiapas, small groups of people who decide to support the revolutionary religion. Chapter 4 is about the agraristas that support the movement and explores the economic case for becoming a Mexican Catholic. Chapter 5 is the history of Mexican Catholicism as a form of local religion. As you can see from this rather grainy, unfortunately unpublishable snap from Chiapas. That's my favorite chapter by far. It's filled with confetti and fireworks, squabbles over fiestas, all of the good stuff that we like when we think about Catholicism in Mexico, maybe. But you can hear indigenous people really deliberating in those documents, and you're privy to their thoughts in a way that you are not in many other places. And really, I try to show that a big part of the 1920s religious crisis was indigenous people siding as Catholics with the Mexican state. They leveraged state power against the Roman Catholic clergy. The things they wanted were like fewer religious taxes, less ecclesiastical intervention in their lives, except at fiesta time. The right to hire and fire their priests was a big goal of many of them had. And the church would bless them rather than condemn them for becoming agraristas. More than anything else, there was a kind of ludic history bubbling away in the background. Perez's supporters wanted to be able to hold fiestas to whichever saints they wanted, and some of the ones in the book are pretty baroque and heterodox, as you'll see in the last chapters. They didn't really want to be utilized by the Mexican Catholic bishops as pawns in a struggle with the Mexican revolutionary state, because that meant suspending public worship, and that in turn meant derailing the kind of cosmic cycle that their communities and their agriculture all depended on. Another major fault line that you'll find in the book is a territorial one. Perez's movement kind of captures a lot of the historical kind of secessionism that we find in Mexican pueblos. Small indigenous groups battling to become independent of mestizo head towns. There are lots of struggles between indígenas and gente de razón in this book. The second and the final chapter are really the ones about the Mexican Catholic clergy, its sometimes baroque and bizarre beliefs. Again, I sometimes think somebody could write a novel about Perez because of his unusual life and his adventures. He did jail time for writing bad things about the Pope. He probably liked to drink too much, but he was a remarkably effective interfacer with indigenous communities and with indigenous pueblos. I also came to think that he was, at the very least, sincere. Nobody can be subjected to that many beatings or that many near lynchings and not really mean what it is that what they say. So the end of the book focuses on some of the priests. These are some of the weirdest ones. You'll see the one there called Eduardo Dávila. He just stuck his head in a piece of propaganda on a picture of Pius IX. There were these kinds of bizarre kind of theatrics that accompanied the movement, but in the end, it was essentially a communitarian kind of indigenous kind of moment. One more thing I would say is that the histories of the Catholic clergy who joined Perez are extremely interesting. Because there was no real way for the Mexican Catholic Church to kind of airbrush its reports. There was no curia, there was no administration. So the things we find in the surviving fragments of Perez's archive are sensationally indiscreet. We hear priests talking about their sexual foibles, which come in all shapes and sizes. We hear them talking about religious doubts, about their liberal political inclinations and many other things. So it's a real under the hood kind of exploration of the Mexican Catholic clergy. Just to finish, since I talked about generalizations, what would I say are the main takeaways from the book, the things I would like people to take away from reading? One of them I think concerns the importance of liberal / enlightened Catholic ideas generally understood in Mexico. We've got very good at exploring those in the context of the 18th century and the 19th century. I'm thinking of Pamela Vogel's new book and also the one before. But we tend to lose sight of those ideas from around the middle of the 19th century and assume that they disappeared or that they were completely kind of erased or written out by the Romanization of the Catholic Church in Mexico. I don't think that's really the case. I think those ideas had a much bigger half-life than we think, and they were still capable of dividing people and causing really significant turbulence into the 1920s and in the 1930s. Something else that I think the story of this unusual movement tells us is that we need to qualify the presumptive secularism of the Mexican revolutionary system and its personnel, many of its personnel. Many revolutionaries, it seems to me, couldn't really give up on that kind of Bourbon-like desire to manage religion, to reform religion, to be kind of church builders. They wanted to be reformers. That was part of their nation-building impulse. They might have been scarred by religion, but they certainly hadn't really moved beyond it. I think we can also see that some of the institutional kind of pivots of the Calles regime also had a kind of strangely Catholic quality. Land reform under Calles, for example, borrows quite heavily from European Protestant / Catholic cooperativism. It uses a very religious rhetoric. The Calles law of 1926, as I said a minute ago, reprises this kind of French constitutional ecclesiology in a very provocative way. So the regime is not really anywhere like as secular as it pretends, or as it would have us believe, and that's an interesting finding, I think. Again, I think the religious conflict, even the Cristero War, needs to be seen essentially as a culture war between Catholicisms, between the church on one side and what I call the church state on the other. a revolutionary regime with obvious debts to pay to Catholic theology and Catholic ideas. We could see that, in fact, in the solution to the Cristero War, the Arreglos, where the elimination of Perez's movement is written into the text. The state is being basically asked to renounce its religious aspirations, such as they are. Maybe the last couple of things I think Perez shows us there was a lot of indigenous engagement with the Mexican Revolution on religious grounds. And we're often told that's not the case. We're often told that indigenous people are ontologically averse to revolutionary anti-clericalism or anti-Catholicism. I don't find that to be the case. I think really many indigenous people, it was a common experience for people to try and utilize or invoke the power of the state in their religious lives and to use that as a counterweight to the power of the Roman Catholic clergy. But then maybe the final point might concern the origins of religious pluralism in Mexico. Again, this is a story that is missionary-centered, US-centered. I think Perez gives us a new dimension on that story, which is the creation of denominational differences between Catholics. And I think that was a novelty, and it was certainly a novelty in indigenous Mexico. So those are the things I hope the book achieves, essentially. And I very much look forward to hearing comments from Jürgen and from Brian.
Thanks, Matthew. That was fantastic. I just finished taking notes myself. Thank you for that. That was great. I look forward to the discussion and the Q&A. But now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first comentarista, Dr. Jürgen Buchenau, who is a professor of history and Latin American studies at University of North Carolina in Charlotte. His research interests include 19th and 20th century Mexico, political economy, political violence, immigration, Mexican world affairs, and the Mexican Revolution. He's written extensively on Calles and the Revolution, and just a couple of titles that I have here. The Sonoran Dynasty in Mexico, Revolution, Reform, and Repression, Impress with the University of Nebraska, the Mexican Revolution, a documentary history, Mexico's Once and Future Revolution, The Last Caudillo, Álvaro Obregón and the Mexican Revolution, Mexican Mosaic, A Brief History of Modern Mexico, Plutarco Elias Calles and the Mexican Revolution. The list goes on. We're very happy to have Jürgen here. Whenever you're ready, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Ricardo and Nathan for allowing me to comment on this presentación del libro. And I'm also honored to be included in the group of HisCatMex, especially as someone without primary expertise in the history of Catholicism in Mexico. So it's a real pleasure for me to comment on Matthew Butler's Mexico's Spiritual Reconquest, Indigenous Catholics and Father Perez's Revolutionary Church. The book is one of the most important interventions in the historiography of 19th, 20th Mexico of the century. It turns much of what we thought we knew about the so-called conflict between church and state upside down. We already knew Matthew Butler as one of the primary interpreters of the battle between Catholics and anti-clericals during the Catholic Calles presidency and the ensuing Maximato. This new study of the Iglesia Católica Apostólica Mexicana, or ICAM, confirms his role as the patriarch of this particular historiography, a field that has seen hundreds, if not thousands, of scholarly interventions, both in Mexico and internationally, particularly in the United States and Mexico. The major achievements of this meticulously researched, well-written, and brilliantly revisionist book are the following. Number one, although the ICAM was born as a political ploy of the Callista boss Morones, the Secretary of Industry, Commerce, and Labor, and the Jefe of the CROM, a confederation of labor unions, it soon thereafter took on a life of its own, especially as the government did not provide it with support following the energetic protests of Roman Catholics. Number two, over the next several years, the ICAM became a major dissident tradition within Catholicism, one that emphasized national Catholic traditions but resisted the Roman Catholic Church's domination from the Holy See, or Vatican, which had been increasing since the time of the First Vatican Council of 1869. Three, the ICAM had hundreds of congregations. It promoted an array of popular manifestations of folk belief, dressed in an appropriately revolutionary and anti-Vatican manner. Contrary to the long-standing belief that the ICAM was nothing more than a Rome creation, it became a dissenting voice within Catholicism, a church with Mexicanized religious practices. Its constituency was heavily indigenous, and its clergy, often more bronze, as Matthew says, than his Roman Catholic counterparts. 4. The story of the ICAM greatly complicates the master narrative of a Manichaean conflict between a secular state and the Roman Catholic Church. Building on Matthew's earlier work, it suggests that the state had a spiritual mission suffused with Catholic principles, although the regime never said the quiet part out loud. The book also questions almost a century of Catholic historiography that insisted that only the Church enjoyed popular support in the conflict. The book suggests that the conflict between the church state, which included the ICAM, and the Roman Catholic Church was a regional one, with the Cristeros and their supporters concentrated in the Bajío and the church state in eastern and central Mexico, an especially heavily indigenous area. The ICAM took advantage of the Roman Catholic Church strike in emerging as a primary purveyor of Catholic services between 1926 and 1929. Some areas in Mexico, including Sonora and much of the rest of the Northwest, remained untouched by either Catholicism during this time. Number 5, the book shows that the arreglos of 1929 were not a mere surrender by the Church that unilaterally disarmed the Cristeros. Rather, by rescinding the registration requirement in the Calles law, which had helped the ICAM, it also struck the major blow against the schismatic church. All of this happened under the aegis of Emilio Portes Gil, while Calles was in Paris. Finally, the ICAM was successful in the countryside, much more so in the cities. Thus, the book also appropriately centers the role of Gobernación Secretary and Veracruz Governor Adalberto Tejeda in the growth of the ICAM, especially in his own region, and distinguishes between Morones' role in the creation of the church and the role of agraristas such as Tejeda in growing and sustaining it thereafter. Naturally, I was so intrigued by the book that I do have a number of questions. First of all, I would like to know more about the role of Calles personally, who, as Matthew points out, did not correspond much with Perez or other ICAM leaders. Familiar as I am with Calles' own correspondence, Calles does not appear to have given the church much thought, other than as a convenient wedge initially to split the faithful. The ICAM certainly used the state to grow, but how much strategizing happened at the very top? To what extent does the anti-clerical turn of 1925-1926 reflect the work of Morones, Tejeda, and War Secretary Joaquín Amaro, and rather than Calles? And thus we could call this a coyuntura that existed specifically after Tejeda replaced the moderate Gilberto Valenzuela as Gobernación Secretary. Especially since relations between Calles and the episcopate, as well as the Holy See, remained at least decent throughout 1925, before crashing after the El Universal incident in February 1926. Second, what connections, if any, existed between the ICAM and expressly southeastern radicals, whom Sarah Austin has studied in her path-breaking recent work? Did any of them expressly reconcile socialism and Catholicism of the Mexican variety? Third, given the intense amount of conflict and change throughout the 1920s and 1930s, how certain are we of the revolutionary, post-revolutionary dividing line, which usually falls on the plan of Agua Prieta in 1920? Is revolutionary Catholicism part of the revolution or the post-revolution? In some ways, might 1929 be seen as a more useful dividing line, given the impact of the arreglos and the concomitant creation of the Partido Nacional Revolucionario? Fourth, in some ways, and particularly in its demand for local autonomy and service in Spanish rather than Latin, the ICAM recalls the growth of Protestant denominations during the 1920s, as Matthew himself points out in his book. Were there personal or political connections? I would be interested, for instance, for example, in the role of Aaron and Moises Sáenz, Protestant secretaries and advisors of the Sonorense presidents. And finally, why did the ICAM not have much support in the Northwest, and Sonora specifically? home to a vibrant Catholicism without churches, as Ignacio Almada has called it. In any event, I wholeheartedly congratulate Matthew on his publication of this seminal book. It will mark a major watershed in the historiography of religion in 1920s Mexico and will make all of us scurry to revise our lectures and seminars on the latter decades of the Mexican Revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jürgen. That was great. I will now introduce our second comentarista, Dr. Brian Connaughton. Brian, are you there? Can you hear me? Just making sure.
Yes, yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic.
Can
Fantastic.
you hear me?
Yes, yes, great. So Dr. Connaughton is a doctor in Latin American Studies by UNAM, and he is also a professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana de Iztapalapa since the 1970s. He is a specialist in cultural history and institutional history of I'm reading from Spanish, of Latin America between the 18th and 19th centuries. But he also studies the history of Mexico and the church between the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Among his recent publications, we have Entre la voz de Dios y el llamado de la patria, religión, identidad y ciudadanía en México, and Ideología y Sociedad en Guadalajara, la Iglesia Católica y la disputa por definir la nación mexicana, among others. Thank you, Dr. Connaughton, for being here with us. You may go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and my congratulations to Matthew on a wonderful book. I'll try to make a few comments. There are many intriguing paths opened in this work. Matthew Butler points up the key work done for ECOM by clergymen and first ECOM bishops Antonio Benigno López y Sierra, Macario López Valdés, and Benigno Gómez Rubalcaba from the Jalisco and Aguascalientes states in the Guadalajara diocese, long known, as he points up, for its liberal tendencies in the 19th century. Butler connects the anti-Roman stance of ECOM back to figures such as Fray Servando Teresa de Mier, but this could be broadened significantly to include even more Orthodox figures within the church. After all, Mexican Catholicism was more dependent on the Spanish king than the Pope for 300 years, and that created certain precedents regarding local ecclesiastical autonomy, as he himself points out. The author mentions other liberal-leaning areas which took a liking to ECOM in the Puebla Highlands, the Huasteca, and Oaxaca. This brings to mind the work of Guy Thompson on popular liberalism and the attraction in some highland Puebla villages in the 19th century for Protestantism with intense local dynamics dividing indigenous peoples and mestizos, a topic much dealt with in this book. But perhaps a major point here is that the author points us in the direction of ecclesiastical culture, suggesting pre-existing divides within Catholicism and its practice, which opened up opportunities for new religious alternatives at the local level. One of these divides, which the author brings to bear to explain the actions of apostate Catholic priests joining ECOM, is not only the Gallican influence emphasizing the need for a national church within Catholicism, but the dire straits of many lower parish clergy. Here, the resentment festering towards vastly more comfortable church authorities has a long history reaching back through centuries. This resentment could sometimes be stirred also by indignation over immorality within the ranks of Catholicism, often associated with indecorous ecclesiastical luxury among the higher ranks, or the presence of Spanish priests in Mexican parishes. Butler also states that ECOM priests sometimes, I quote him, resemble the aesthetic primitive prototype. And he also brings up the renewed interest in Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, thought of as the selfless redeemer of the Indian. ECOM under Perez sometimes ordained campesinos or indigenous religious specialists, and this appealed to some of its priests and many of its followers. Certainly of great interest in terms of further research is what the author calls a vague post-Jansenist theology, emphasizing priests' rights vis-a-vis the church authority, the church hierarchy, and Rome. Studies on the 18th and 19th centuries have pointed to similar tendencies back then. These different elements, many brought into the analysis by the author to explain the affiliation and conduct of priests who joined ICAM, suggest not only the existence of ecclesiastical culture, but also of ecclesiastical traditions of minority opinions within the Catholic Church dating back centuries. We might, for example, remember Miguel Hidalgo of 1810, 1811, denouncing his excommunication as a political act without any theological grounding or authority. Other Mexican clergymen of the time authorized electing vicarios militares, or military chaplains within the insurgent ranks, to comply with the ecclesiastical functions, the episcopal functions in particular, that the royalist bishops had abandoned once they had condemned the movement. Jose Maria Morelos, when taken captive in 1815, was found to have a major work on the rights of the civil patron, more formally the king, over all ecclesiastical actions. One might also remember the uproar in Mexico against the papal bull of Leon XII in 1824, which asked Mexican and other now independent Americans to renew loyalty to Ferdinand VII. Major debates took place in the Mexican press regarding the First Vatican Council in 1871. And of course, as the author points out, Bishop Eduardo Sanchez Camacho of Tamaulipas even took issue with the crowning of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the 1990s, although this would cost him his prelacy. We might add that Agustin Rivera, who Matthew Butler singles out as one of the rather non-conforming Catholics within the Mexican clergy in the late 19th and early 20th century, saw fit to publish Benito Jerónimo Feijóo's critique of miracle culture gone amok, which Feijóo had included in his Teatro Crítico Universal in the first half of the 18th century. Even as loyal and steadfast a Catholic bishop as Pedro Espinosa of Guadalajara, when exiled by the Juarez government in 1861, decided to make his trip to Rome through the United States, had himself informed there of Catholic advances in the Protestant neighbor, and then wrote to Archbishop Lázaro de la Garza y Ballesteros, suggesting that the prolonged ecclesiastical stance in favor of a Catholic Church, Mexican state unity might have been a major error on the part of the clergy itself. All of which is to say that Mexican Catholicism had long had dissidents of greater or lesser orthodoxy long before the ICAM schism. And ICAM in many ways reflected their rippling effect over time. ICAM did assuredly go much further in defiance of the Catholic hierarchy. Actually, schism and its rebellious alternative to constituting its own clerical ranks. But back in 1826, the Mexican city press had publicly discussed electing priests and bishops without consulting the Holy See. It didn't happen back then, but it's hard not to see that the critical ideas circulated rather freely in the decades after independence, even doing away with the clerical fuero, or jurisdictional prerogative, had priestly supporters such as Jose de Jesus Huerta of Jalisco in 1833, 1834 in the Mexican National Congress. The expropriation of 15 million pesos of church holdings to pay for the war with the United States in 1847 was approved by Minister of Justice and Ecclesiastical Affairs and priest Andrés López de Nava. The liberal reformers in their constitution of 1857 had clerical apologists before, during, and after the War of Reform in 1858 to 1860. One of them, Juan José Caserta, was actually a canon of the Guadalajara Cabildo Eclesiástico, or Bishop's Council. It's Perhaps easier in this context to understand Butler's assertion to conclude his study, not just a Chrome patsy. Perez was a rebel who mediated the exclusion felt by indigenous Catholics and some lower clergy. He adds that ICAM began as Chrome agitprop and became a Pueblo-centric medium through which the regime channeled indigenous religious support during the Cristero War and beyond. Startling, but still credible, the author states that Callismo thus exhibited a paradoxical reform-minded Catholicity, as Matthew has just pointed up in his presentation, not just brash secularism. Evidently, too, the regime derived some religious legitimation from ICAM and favored it at least until 1929. Intriguing, as the author no doubt intends, is his assertion that Perez, the ICAM patriarch, was probably a factor in Roman hierarchy's development of an indigenous apostolate in the 1950s. If ICAM was, as Matthew Butler suggests, a rearguard defense of indigenous costumbre, it may also be connected in some ways to the burgeoning culture of new popular saints, such as Jesus Malverde, La Santa Muerte, and others, but even to a new sensitivity to ethnic and local spiritual values manifest, among other places, in the Catholic clergy itself. So I guess a question which merits being discussed here is this: if ICAM has a past, and Matthew Butler even sketches lightly a present in Mexico today, does it? And discussion regarding religious values and ecclesiastical organization as variables have a future in Mexico in the upcoming years. Perhaps we might have some ideas from our audience on that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian, for those comments. Matthew, I'll let you go ahead and answer both Jürgen and Brian at your leisure, and then whenever you're done, we'll open up the floor for questions.
Well, thank you both so much for those very insightful comments, very generous comments, and also for the really wonderful questions. I feel like I've been tag teamed by two luchadores libres, one coming out of the Catholic history corner, one coming out of the Mexican Revolution corner. So it may take me a while to wriggle free. But I'll do my best to answer as many of the questions as I can, albeit quite quickly. So Kay's role, Jürgen asked, that's really a curious thing. I think Kay is, he's not ill-disposed to the idea of a national church, I don't think. How much he knew before it happened, how much foreknowledge he had is an unanswerable question. I find it impossible to think that he had no inkling. That to me is just not credible. I mean, given what we know about Kay is. Possibly Morones kept things from him. I find that also very credible, that there was the deniable plausibility built into this. There was need to know stuff. I think Kay is stung by the ferocity of the response to Perez. I really think that's the case, that he stood and watched to see how this would develop, and he didn't like the immediate developments at all. If you read the book, one of the other things I'd like to explore is the tremendously negative press coverage that Kay has personally received because of his association with Perez, and the fact that he just sent Perez one telegram. It's the only recorded two-way communication between the two of them. Perez would send Kay his birthday greetings and things like that down the years, but they were never ever answered. So I think Kay is intrigued but gives up. Morones is definitely the one at the beginning, and even more than Morones, Ricardo Trevino, who's the one who's connected to people in the Mexican Catholic hierarchy. The Southeastern question is a really interesting one. Again, I don't have a particularly satisfying answer, and people like Sarah Austin, maybe, and Ben Falor, who's here on the call, who've done a lot more work than me on that region, and know, we now see that the Southeast is the crucible of the revolution in many ways, in some of its more systemic ways. The one party kind of model comes out of there, at least according to Sarah's book. Yet it's disappointing when it comes to this this religious experiment. I think maybe there are a couple of reasons for that. One no joke is that Perez didn't know that region. ICAM really relied a lot on Perez's personal kudos with indigenous elites. He knew all those people. He'd been doing the rounds for decades in Puebla, Veracruz, Oaxaca, that whole kind of belt, Mexico. He knew many of those people personally. So I think when Perez goes and talks to those people, is often when you get this movement taking shape. That couldn't really happen in Tabasco. Perez had never been to Tabasco, never been to Yucatan, didn't know those people. So I think that's one reason. I think also the Southern Revolution is less equivocal about religion. We see that with Garrido, we see it with Carrillo Puerto. This kind of like, halfway house between, the bright secular utopia and the Catholic past is not going to convince people in those areas. This is a slight contradiction, but also there are other currents of spirituality strong in those regions, especially theosophy maybe in the Yucatan. So people have somewhere else to go if they want to experiment with other religious ideas. So I think I would say that. About the religious dividing line, is this a revolutionary or a post-revolutionary expression? I think obviously, it comes about through the particular set of circumstances that bring Calles into power, the insecurity of the Calles regime, its institution building mindset. But I think this is, as Brian was saying in much more eloquently than I should be able to do, the momentum that comes historically to the through lines from the insurgency through Fray Servando, people like that, I think are really clear. Perez is an old guy. Perez was born and possibly remembers before the separation of church and state. He was 8 when church and state were separated in Mexico. So what I say in the introductions is that we have to think it's important to remember this idea of ongoingness. We assume that the separation of church and state was done. Somebody like Perez could remember a time when it was undone or before it was done. So the reversibility is a possible thing. So I think there is a lot of afterburners from previous ideas about liberalism and Catholicism in Mexico. The Protestant denominations, the sciences. I have no knowledge that the Science Brothers were particularly involved in this. Again, it would be interesting to know more about their particular brand of Protestantism and why they might have avoided it. I think there's an empirical reason, also a conceptual reason why I don't pursue that maybe in the way that I should. The empirical one is that I think Mexican Catholics were clear about who they were. They weren't trying to become Protestant. They weren't necessarily looking for the support of US mission stations. That was buried into the propaganda at every possible turn. I think conceptually, if you read something like a book by Jean-Pierre Bastian, his book on Protestants, many of us have read that book, and he assigns a very precursory role to people like Perez. They're just half-baked Protestants. These are people who are waiting to move forward to the extra step. This is just a signpost towards a Protestant future. I'm much more persuaded by the arguments of Brian and others who study the kind of liberal Catholic tradition in Mexico, that it's real, that it's strong and it's deep and it has quite a strong current. It's not Protestantism light. It's a distinctive set of religious ideas that go with particular set of political ideas. Why not the Northwest? I think was the last question, Jürgen, you kindly asked. Probably for the same reason as why not the Southeast. Perez had never been there. I can't give you a much better answer than that. I don't know if it has the same kind of concentration of indigenous pueblos and ethnic groups. I mean, I'm sure it's a complex religious terrain. I don't know how good a fit ICAM would necessarily have been with that, but yeah, it would be interesting to know why that didn't happen. There were early efforts, but they never really paid off. And Brian, thank you for the excellent history lesson. I mean, we should all, I hope we're all taking notes. I shall go back and look at the YouTube channel. And it's the depth. I think there's depth and the 3 dimensions that you put behind this that are really important. This is one of the reasons why this book took me a long time to write. I had to try and become more sure-footed as a historian of 19th century Mexico. What's the foundation of this? What is the ideological development of this in Mexico? I think you asked about Fray Servando and why not go beyond Fray Servando to the kind of regalists and the Spanish doctors and so on. I guess my answer to that is that the book had to begin and end somewhere, but a better answer, obviously. I think my impression of regalism in Mexico and the kinds of religious experiments that we associate with it tend to be much more in the realm of kind of enlightened despotism. They're driven by reformist bishops. This is emphatically a parish priest's endeavor, as you say. It draws on a different set of antagonism. So that's why I track it more closely to Fray Servando, to the early historiography of the independents, as you rightly say, where independence priests are contrasted with royalist cabildos and royalist bishops. That's the lineage, I think. Fray Servando also comes back to us in Mexico from France. He was actually there in the French Revolutionary Constitutional Church, or he says he was. He said all sorts of things, called himself the Bishop of Baltimore and Lord knows what. But he appeared to have a connection to that, and he was also involved in some of those 1820s documents that you describe. I think the idea of ecclesiastical kind of subcultures in Mexico is a really important one, and I think it's easier to say that for the 19th century. When you get to the 20th century, we're talking all the time about Romanization, infallibility, blah blah blah. So there's a facade of homogenization that has happened, that has been pushed through at double quick speed through the Colegio Pio Latino. Through the return of those Rome-educated prelates to the seminaries and to the dioceses in Mexico. So I think it's become much harder for people to talk in a liberal Catholic idiom in Mexico, in fact, not just in Mexico, but all over the place. So that's why I tried to kind of dig up the examples of Perez and people like that. That's why I think, actually, the patriarch was somebody who was of retirement age, rather than the kind of baby-faced Cristero priest that we see so often on the postcards and in the literature. These are people who had a religious formation that was prelapsarian. I mean, it was before that kind of whole Roman effort. That also, I think, is why you get these kind of particular pivots in places like Guadalajara, Puebla, that were historically liberal, but by the 1920s are not, and you get these kind of dissonance coming out of those places. The Spanish priest thing, I think, is a really important thing too. That's definitely something that we should think about a lot more. In the Yucatan, that's very plain. But I think also in other parts of Mexico, there is this kind of resentment about the Gachupin clergy coming. It feeds into a discourse of priest rights. But I'll stop there in case there are more questions. But thank you both for your really wonderful comments and questions.
Great. Thank you, Matthew and Jürgen and Brian. So now we're going to open up the floor for questions. And the questions could be either in English or Spanish, right? Podemos responder a las preguntas en español también, como prefieran los colegas. We'll open up the floor, and whenever anyone is ready, please feel free to jump in or raise your hand. Thank you. Go ahead, Christina.
Hello, I am so looking forward to reading this book, but wonder, you've told us a lot about the leadership and the fascinating figure who we do need to learn more about, the Patriarch Perez himself. But in thinking of the formulation that you, and I think one of the commentarists repeated, thinking about not just the past, but also the present and maybe even the future of the ICAM or things like it, from a lived religiosity perspective, I wondered how much could you tell us about like the members of the church, and in particular, that's something that's always interesting for me, the vision of training the next generation through things like, were there things like the catechism, like who was organizing this, who was organizing parish life, what was parish life like, or church community life like? Did you find sources about that? And again, it just like knowing more about the people who are making these decisions and deciding to invest themselves, their lives, their beliefs into this religious organization. What did they, or how did they participate themselves, and especially how did they envision themselves transmitting these beliefs to subsequent generations. What did you find out about that? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it reminds me that I skipped Brian's invitation to talk about the future, and you asked the question as well, Christina. There are places in Mexico where this offshoot of Catholicism is still very popular. In Tuxtla Gutierrez, with the cult of San Pascual Bailón, and there are municipios in Veracruz where you find large numbers of Mexican Catholics. In a few places, they are the majority in Tepehua places, for example. So there are some afterburners. One of the points I make in the introduction is that whenever you have Catholicisms that are hegemonic but not as universal as their name suggests, or wherever politicians are frightened about the political clout of the Catholic Church, you're going to have Perez's. So it's hard to gaze in a crystal ball. Historians are notoriously bad at doing that, and it should be discouraged as a general rule. But I think that there are things that we could imagine in future, a migrant church that adopted an autonomous kind of persona. Churches that stressed ordination of women priests or gender questions. You can imagine that the fault lines between mainstream Catholicism and dissident Catholicism would move. There's no reason why they should remain stuck in kind of staid 19th, 20th century nationalisms and flag waving. That's certainly what we see in Chiapas. It's a folk religious tradition that is the core. In Mexico City, although the leader of this movement just died a couple of years ago, there's a church out by the airport where there is a bleeding hostia. So it's this kind of Eucharistic miracle. That is the thing. So as the mainstream church has shifted away from its, post-Vatican II to a different place, then the space for dissidence changes. So I think we will see these kind of movements recur. About parish life and parish living in the next generation, the reason these movements nearly always flounder, or very often flounder, is the difficulty of reproduction. It's hard to get bishops to leave the Roman Catholic Church and then to propagate the offshoot. Perez tried very hard to do that. He ended up getting his episcopal orders in Chicago from an Italian called Carfera who placed hands on him. So they are very focused on the present. Because they have to survive these tremendous kind of political onslaughts. Perez did create a kind of seminary. His church in Corpus Christi, which is just opposite the avenue, on the Avenida Juarez, just opposite the Juarez Monument, was the kind of de facto seminary for the Mexican Catholic Church. So they were thinking about training individuals. A lot of the training was done on the job, frankly. It was an empirical kind of movement in that sense. So one priest would train another. They would spend a year or two going around in the countryside, learning the different rituals and what have you. So it's a slightly more sketchy answer, I'll admit. Parish life, on the other hand, could be surprisingly vigorous and surprisingly rich because these were priests who were very, very beholden to their parishioners. Like the structural weakness that those individuals had, that their credentials could be questioned. Political fluctuations could really hurt them as well as help them. They had to work quite hard to satisfy popular taste when they could. We find all kinds of evidence in the documents, for example, that indigenous people were very keen to hear excellent sermons. I don't know if that's like some kind of Baroque aftershoot. They wanted an oratorial display of fireworks to begin the fiesta. So priests that could do that were very, very popular. There was one called Vicente Liñán, who was apparently was a tremendous thespian and could reduce his parishioners to tears, and he was the kind of the star performer of this movement. So they were plugged into kind of local Catholic cultures and the expectations of indigenous people. And so there was a parish life in that sense.
Are there any other questions? Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, Matthew, I've had the pleasure of sharing many panels with you on this. And I believe in one you mentioned Afro-Mestizo parishes around the Gulf Coast area. And obviously indigenous Catholicism is incredibly important for your book and for the history of Mexico. But could you speak to the attraction that ECOM had for these communities?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the information about Afro-Mestizo communities is much thinner on the ground than it is for indigenous communities. There are certain places where ICAM is popular, so it must have traversed Afro-Mestizo communities. Certainly in Guerrero, I mean, there are a few, a few dozen ICAM outposts there on the Costa Chica and places like that. Unfortunately, those are the least reported parts of the movement, which is a great shame. Maybe because there were cristeros there in parts of Guerrero, it was a less safe place to be. ICAM didn't have that many martyrs, but some of them were from that very region in Guerrero, which is unfortunate. The other place, I guess, is in Veracruz. So one of the places that the movement puts down quite deep roots is in the Sotavento, the kind of leeward area around Veracruz, the historic kind of cattle ranging place. So there are instances. And I talk about one on the Hacienda of Cuyocuenda, which is an Angolan phrase. I forget what it means, but these are historic Afro-Mestizo hacienda communities that invite Perez in. In Mexico, it seems to me usually, in those places, it seems usually to be a kind of agrarian stroke kind of communitarian type deal. That's a place of landlord gangs and the Mano Negra and places like that. So to have a helpful conduit of communication with Gobernación, to be playing the regime's religious game, can be a very helpful thing. There are also particular santos and santuarios and shrines in those regions that people want to control. That's certainly the case in Cuyocuenda. There is the Virgen de la Aparecida, known as the Virgen de la O, that is very important in those regions. So it usually is a kind of mixture of the devotional, the saintly, and definitely this worldly that drives these things, whether it's in Afro-Mestizo or indigenous communities.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Actually, if I could ask a second one, first of all, Matthew, thank you for the lucha libre illusion, and I won't ask you whether the tag team of rudos or técnicos, but maybe we can discuss that later. But my question is building on Brian's very suggestive and I think generative comments. Is could this have worked at another time, say in the teens during the heat of the armed phase when the Episcopal hierarchy had broken down and it was not possible to sort of put up these clerical bulwarks and liturgical trenches that the institutional church used to make sure that this did not become a full-fledged divide?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there were efforts made, no question about it. So somebody like Father Paredes in Mexico City, who sneaks in through the back window, as Pius XI says, and takes over the cabildo and governs the diocese semi-licitly for 5 years, is a good example. I think there is something special about the Cristero period, though, and that is the national suspension of public religious worship. That creates a spiritual stroke existential crisis in many people's minds in Mexico. I still think Jean Mayer is correct about that. I just think there are more crises than he admits in his book. So for him, it's a Eucharistic crisis. This is mestizo peasants, very orthodox. They can't go to mass, therefore they rebel. In indigenous communities, it's very, very different. The crisis is related to festive culture primarily, to honoring the santos, to keeping the kind of cosmic wheel spinning, to participating in costumbre, those kinds of things. So once a yearly or twice yearly kinds of experiments. So I think that makes the difference. That is the essential difference. That kind of cosmic moment is more suggestive, even than in the 1910s, even in 1915. And it's also an act of self-harm by the Roman Catholic hierarchy in one sense. in the middle years of the revolution, as you know, Ben, the regime expels the bishops. And they're fleeing violence. In 1926, they do this to themselves, and that's what parents will often say, that they have withdrawn, they have abandoned you. And some of the most moving correspondence in the whole pile is from people writing to their bishops saying, "No nos dejen, no nos abandonen, don't leave now. You can go after our fiesta, but we need you right now, so don't leave." Those kinds of imploring comments that come through, and so people are in a brand new kind of predicament. Even the parish clergy has gone, and so there is a vacancy in the business, in the front of the business.
Thank you.
Nathan, go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to thank you, Matthew, for your great book talk. Learned a lot, and this really provides a very different perspective on literature so far within this era too, right? Thinking about kind of the early 20th century. So I just had a couple more, just kind of less about the content, more just about the book itself. So I did put the link to the book where you can purchase it in the chat. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about where people can access this book in various ways. And I'm particularly thinking about our colleagues in Mexico. How can they access this book? And also, do you plan on translating this book into Spanish? Think about our colleague, Gemma Santa Maria, who recently translated her book, for example.
Yeah. I plan on having someone else translate it into Spanish. I translated the last one, and it's unbelievably hard work. I don't recommend it unless you're a professional translator, and I'm not volunteering this time. But yeah, I would love to publish this in Spanish, and because the interest is obviously there. Perez is a folkloric figure in Mexico. People, historically minded people will know who he was. Where you can get the book, you can get it from the University of New Mexico website, which I think I put in the presentation. If you would like one, especially if you're in Mexico, then drop me a line. There's an author discount policy at UNM, which is quite generous, so it will definitely save you a few pesos. So those are the places. I think there's an ebook, actually. There is also an ebook available on the website.
Thanks so much.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, just two things. I think it would be interesting for people to see Matthew's book in connection with Bill Taylor's Magistrates of the Sacred. There are numerous points in which this structural weakness that he just mentioned of parish priests coincides what he found with what William Taylor found in the late 18th century. And of course, that's the Bourbon Reform period, which Matthew does refer to repeatedly. And another thing, I was thinking in terms of the Gallican tradition, not so much in terms of the bishops. I'm thinking of people like Sabino Crespo, the cura párroco that Carolina Ibarra González wrote about, and people like El Padre Cos, who and also the José de San Martín, the canon of Oaxaca, the Catedral de Oaxaca, who all go back to actually Febronius, and actually Febronius is going to be cited by some of these people, not all of them, but the arguments are basically the same. And then Febronius is going to come into the debates in the 1820s, right? And so this is a vision of a decentralized Catholic Church. As a matter of fact, in the 20s, Juan Bautista Morales talks of the historical structure of the church as being a republic in which the Pope is a president, but not a king. And so this actually feeds in to your emphasis on the Indians, Indian pueblos as being the agents, because it's coming from let's say from ground level upwards instead of from the upper floor downwards. It's a vision of a mosaic, a Catholic mosaic, in which the different parts all have a strong autonomous identity, right? And so for the Creoles, it was the nation. For the pueblos antes de indios, it's nosotros, los pueblos, y mi pueblo, no? And so I think there's more there for us to eventually discuss in terms of this historical groundwork, right? That's supporting, I think, much of what you say and you allude to throughout the book in a very suggestive way.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true, Brian. There's a long prehistory to this. That's kind of what I'm looking at the moment. On the other hand, Perez, Perez is a country priest from Oaxaca, so I'm kind of bound by the chronology that he brings to the movement in some regards. So he will say that his forebears, Fray Servando, the Padres Constitucionalistas of the Reform, you just mentioned a couple of them. That's the lineage that he's operating in. I truly don't think Perez has read Febronius. He's not an intellectual figure. He's aware of this tradition that he's operating in. Is he aware of its kind of full ecclesiological kind of theoretical basis? I have real doubts about that. He is part of the half-life of that fascinating tradition that you've discussed and that Bill Taylor's also discussed. So I think I would say that. Surely there are like Poles in Mexico, Oaxaca maybe one, Jalisco another, where these traditions are more are stronger, and other places where they're weaker. One of the questions that's unanswered to me actually is that the places where Perez is strongest, the Archdiocese of Mexico, the Archdiocese of Puebla running into Veracruz, those are the two core places where his movement gets most traction. Those were kind of enlightened 18th century dioceses, and yet they're supposed to have been very unsuccessful experiments, or sometimes you read that they were very unpopular experiments. I'm wondering about that in actual fact, because it does seem that there was some kind of there was a plausibility about Perez in those places that could be connected to his familiarity with indigenous people, but also may have a kind of theological basis as well. So yeah.
I have a question, Matthew, and I think we might be wrapping up soon, but I wanted to ask, with Perez's church, was there any support from local elites who were not part of a political establishment, upper class folk, upper class lady, men and women? Do you find any of that in the different geographical regions that you're studying?
Sometimes you do, yeah, you do occasionally, especially in places like Veracruz. When Perez's mailbag comes in, you realize that there are these kind of, groups of religious thinkers and sometimes radicals across Mexico, and they go to Perez and they try and dialogue with him and see what his movement's all about and what it's made of. He corresponded an awful lot with a woman from Veracruz called her last name was Rabulin. And she spoke in these super kind of positive tones about Perez and his movement. And she clearly is an educated person. She is a kind of patron of the movement in particular places. One suspects that she is actually supporting financially various priests. And yet her interest appears to be purely religious. This is a half political and half religious movement. I've tried to be honest about that in the book, that without the kind of political framing of the Cristero War and the kind of tensions that emerged from that, it's hard to see this movement developing in the way that it did. The key players, and again, this is why I think that the kind of Crom incident in La Soledad is a red herring. The people who really help this along are indigenous principales. Alcaldes, postmasters, sacristans, all of those people, that kind of slightly amorphous realm of indigenous office holding, just needs a few of them in one particular place to start talking about this, to say that in the village down the road this happened and it worked out okay, they had the fiesta, and you get this kind of domino effect happening. So indigenous elites are truly the core of this. Mm-hmm. And that's why I liken Perez to somebody like Porfirio Diaz or to Tejeda as well. Perez is very good at talking to those people. He's much better at doing that than some, Roman bishops from Michoacan who end up in Veracruz and they're talking about the Sacred Heart and, pilgrimage to Rome or what have you. Perez is much more centered and much more grounded in that world, and he's remarkably effective. But he needs the help of the kind of middling, indigenous, rural groups to do it.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that last point, so is the Cismática worried in the sense that, like the Roman Catholic Church is worried about some of these popular indigenous movements? Is that dynamic present there as well? Throughout the interwar period, as we've seen after the revolution, is that part of Perez's movement as well, trying to rein in some of the more popular religious folks, who might have really burst onto the Cristero rebellion, guns blazing and all sorts of things?
Yeah. Perez is super eclectic. I mean, he has to be. The asymmetry is so obvious that here is Perez fighting this this very powerful religious community stroke institution in the Roman Catholic Church. Even with the support of the state, it's a difficult thing for him to do. So Perez doesn't tend to turn people away. It's a very eclectic movement. It has a lot of bandwidth for strategic reasons, presumably, but also for the same reasons that Perez thinks it's okay for him to be doing what he's doing. People are autonomous religious actors. The kind of jurisdictional claims of Rome are bunk. People can go their own way and they can interpret scriptures and they do things like that. Perez welcomes an awful lot of those people with open arms. He can justify these as expressions of Mexican spirituality. These are good Mexican ways of being Catholic. He's got a pretext in his back pocket as well. So it's hard. You don't often find cases of Perez, rejecting people. He rejects people that reject his authority. Again, there's a little kind of tyrannical streak in Perez. He doesn't want other people to claim allegiance to other institutions. But so long as they are working in his group, that's pretty much okay.
Great, thank you. We're getting some notes of congratulations on the chat, Matthew, by the way, which you can see for yourself. Folks who have been in and out are really excited about this book, as are we, certainly. Is there anyone else who has any questions? ¿Alguna última pregunta before we close out the session? It looks like in that case, this is it for us for now. But Matthew, I mean, if this conversation has been any indication, this is going to be the book that keeps on giving for the next couple of years, certainly, right? As we dive into the historiography, and as Jürgen mentioned, many of us rethink a lot of of this periodization that we tend to take for granted. So thank you for really educating us today on this topic. Thank you for those of you, Jürgen and Brian, for your comments. It was fantastic to have you both on. And those of you who stuck around for the Q&A, thank you as well. Thank you, Nathan, for co-hosting. If no one else has anything left to say, all we want to announce here is that we will continue to have these book talks next year, next school year, and perhaps maybe one through the summer. It depends on when books are published and when folks approach us about these opportunities. But if any of you have any books coming up that might be in press, that might be published within the next year or so, and you want to get into our line of programming, please make sure you email us at hiscatmex@gmail.com. We always want to promote that new scholarship, especially as Nathan mentioned, to our colleagues in Mexico, as well as colleagues here. We look forward to just having authors on and sharing this experience with us. So please feel free to email us if there's any publications coming up that you think our members should be aware of. Nathan, is there anything you want to add?
Thank you so much, Ricardo. I want to thanks to Matthew, to Brian, and Jürgen one more time for presenting and commenting today. It was really a great book talk overall. And one thing I just mentioned in the chat right here too. So we are planning on having more book talks, as Ricardo mentioned. One that's in the works right now is with Dr. Jaime Pensado's book that's coming out this year. So we want to showcase his book as well. But I think Ricardo said, if any of you have any books coming out or your colleagues, please feel free to share with the network. And in addition to book talks, we are next year hoping to continue on with our archive series as well. And so we even had one of the archivists here earlier. It looks like she took off, but Selena Alaman was here. So if there's any archives in particular that you would like to have showcased, this is an opportunity as well. So we are continuing our programs into the next academic year and beyond.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you all. This is fantastic. Everybody have a great evening. Enjoy the beginning of the summer. We'll be in touch. Thank you again. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adios, gracias. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Adios.